Thank you for tuning in today. If this is your first time come to one of our webinars, my name is Roland and I do events and publicity for Educate Ventures Research. As we all know, there is a waiting room for each of our webinars, so whilst I'm doing this greeting, I'm also letting everybody into the room. So if I look away for a minute, then that's what I'm doing. Just a reminder that you're all automatically muted when entering the room, and I will be switching any cameras in the audience off just so that none of us are distracted from any of the speakers that we got today. Today's webinar is a continuation of our education reform series that Educating its friends and colleagues began several months ago off the back of the joint statement on education reform that was issued to the UK government. We'll be looking at the topic of SEND and vulnerable learners inside the current education ecosystem, and have a great cast of stars who have kindly offered up their time and expertise to be with us this morning. To remind everybody, this is an ongoing webinar series exploring education reform from many angles that Educate has been running, and during the course of today's session, I'll put details of the next webinar, the last one for spring, which will focus on what data has been gathered throughout COVID and how much we can trust it and leverage it for the purposes to benefit everybody in the educational stakeholder ecosystem. So I'm going to put that link in the chat window, and if you like today's webinar, then I encourage you to sign up for the next one. If you have any questions during this webinar, please type them into the chat. We will get to them if our panel has time. And finally, I am actually collecting a little bit of feedback on the series. So for people who have joined several of them, I'm interested to know what everyone's thoughts on it are. It's just 3 questions like, what have you liked? What have you not liked? What do you think we should be focusing on in the future? We do plan to come back in the autumn, and discussion in the team has sort of already centered around assessments and sort of GCSE reform, because it doesn't look like that topic is going away anytime soon. So anyway, I'll put the link to that feedback form in the chat window in the course of today's session as well. So anyway, enough of me yakking on, and to give the panel as much time as possible to speak, I'll be handing over to Lord Jim Knight, who I'm delighted has come to MC the event once more. Please, when you are ready, Jim, please feel free to take it away.
Thank you very much, Roland, and lovely to be back with another one of these lovely events, and with a great panel talking about a really interesting area around SEND that I think, well, I've been having more and more conversations about myself, so I've been really looking forward to this. For those that don't know me, I am a recovering politician in the House of Lords. I'm a recovering TES executive now, doing a bunch of other interesting things, and working with schools, working around education. And currently, this week, hot news, I've introduced a private member's bill into Parliament to embed climate and sustainability into the national curriculum, which is all very exciting. Should anyone agree with it. Now, let me then introduce our guests. So we've got Helen. Hello, Helen. Do you want to give us a 30-second and no more introduction all about yourself?
I'm an SEN teacher 2 days a week in a state school, and the rest of the time I'm a dyslexia specialist assessor and specific learning difficulties. I also do an absolute wodge of research. Interestingly, about 10 minutes before this meeting, a book I'm involved in authoring came through about climate change education on a project I'm working on. So literally it sat next to me. And yeah, I absolutely go bonkers crazy about the ridiculousness of SEN reform laws and stuff. So that's me.
Great, thank you, Helen. So Lorraine, do you want to do the same intro? There's a nice segue talking about SEN reforms.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'm Lorraine Peterson. I am, or was, a primary school teacher and head teacher. I was also Chief Executive Officer of NASON for 10 years. And for the last 8 years, have worked independently, passionate about SEND and mental health and wellbeing as well. And really looking forward to today's webinar.
Thank you very much. And then the next one round is Julia. Hi.
Hi, so I'm Professor Julia Carroll. I'm a researcher based in the Centre for Global Learning, Education and Attainment at Coventry University. So I do research into different aspects of education, particularly around attainment gaps and disparity, and particularly around special educational needs and disabilities in different ages. Yeah.
Good, thank you. And by no means least, Gareth.
Hello, so I'm Gareth Morwood. I spent 25 years working in UK schools, 17 of which as Senko in a big secondary school in the Northwest. At the same time doing a bit of research and trying to support mainly autistic learners that have been excluded from other schools. And currently I'm educational advisor at Studio 3, combining sort of wider SEND issues with a real focus on eliminating restrictive practices and seclusion in various settings around the globe.
Great, thank you very much. So we've got a great team together, and I'll be keeping an eye on the chat. So as anyone has any questions or comments to sort of input into the conversation, just post them into the chat and I will do my best to include them. Let's start with school shutdown, the last 12 months, and you know, what's it been like in schools? And thank you instantly for putting your hand up, Helen. Your enthusiasm is infectious. Yeah, just I suppose in part what I'm interested in with that is, yes, hearing what it's been like for both teachers and obviously for learners, but also the narrative feels like it's just been terrible for everyone. And just it'd be interesting to unpack that a bit.
From my end, I'm a teacher, but I spent my time in school. So I'm 2 days a week contracted, and those 2 days I was in looking after key worker kids. And in the kids that were in and that were tied to a computer all day without being able to wriggle, because they ran the school timetable in the second lockdown, they sort of lost their sparkle, some of them. And my school's brilliant, it did so much. But a lot of the kids I work with private tutoring as well, they lost their sparkle. But the flip side is some other kids that I tutor, because they could, and some research that I'm in the process of writing up as well, some children have found that the capacity to use tech at their own speed, have pre-recorded lessons so you can pause, stop, play, rewind and go over things again, has been absolutely transformational. So that the notion that it's all been terrible, I think, is a little bit disingenuous. It's not been ideal because we're in the middle of a pandemic, like duh, but it's not been terrible, because actually for some kids with specific learning difficulties, and quite a lot of kids who find the sort of sensory overload of full-time mainstream school with everyone in too much, actually it's been positively transformational. So the notion of all bad is unhelpful, I think.
Yeah, thank you. Lorraine.
Yeah, I agree totally with Helen. I've seen children that have really struggled, have not been able to engage in home learning. But I've also seen youngsters who have absolutely thrived on being able to work at their own pace using technology, and do it in their own time. So they may not be ready to work at 9 o'clock in the morning, but actually by 10:30 and they've had their breakfast, but they'll work till 5 o'clock at night. So yeah. I think there's been real positives and negatives. I think the group that have missed out most are those youngsters who have got an education, health and care plan, or are on SEN support, who should have been getting additional and or different provision from maybe people outside of the school. Yeah. So especially in the first lockdown, when nearly all of the therapists had to go and work for the NHS, obviously for the pandemic, and so there was no, there was no additional support. And of course, the government also relaxed some of the laws, which meant that local authorities didn't have that ultimate duty. They only had to have best endeavours. So I think that group may have missed out a bit on that external support.
And Lorraine, that's really helpful to start to sort of segment on the sort of spectrum of thrived and have really struggled. Would you characterize any particular group in the thrived end?
I suppose it's probably the group of our autistic learners who actually, like the flexibility of it all, and haven't missed the environment of a busy school and the noise and all the sensory overload, that being at home they've been able to access their work in that sort of quiet, confined space that many of them enjoy working in.
Brilliant, thank you. And thank you both for putting your hands up, and then when you finish, put them down again. Gareth, have you seen the same sort of pattern?
Yeah, I think in essence, anything that is a blanket policy or assumes presumption that everybody can access a singular input is going to mean some people are disadvantaged and some people are advantaged. And I think a lot of my work during that first lockdown was very much with families who had young people in crisis situations, let's put it that way. And I think actually a big benefit from that was reduction of demands for appointments, court appearances, etc., and actually reducing a lot of those demands, but also a lot of the therapists who weren't redeployed offering online clinics. So a family with 3 siblings didn't have to spend half a day battling to park at a hospital to attend their appointment, for example, was hugely positive. And I think what we were able to do in working directly with those families was change the dynamic and the pressures within the group. And I think the other thing that I'd just feed in that may come into further discussions is that I think when schools really knew their young people and families well and didn't see the home as an extension of school, but actually we were trying to support education in their home, it was a very different dynamic to trying to impose regimes into somebody else's house, in effect, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, that all makes sense. That's interesting. I'm just looking at some of the comment in the chat where Fran, for example, talking about the COVID guidance seeming to trump the legal aspects of the EHCP. But Zoe also, interestingly, the learners with sensory overload are now having great difficulties with adjusting to being back, and this is causing difficulties. So I wanted to go in that direction, and maybe Julia, you might have some thoughts on this, but again, the narratives have a lot been about learning loss, and that's the generalized narrative. But there's been other loss too, and obviously there's a strong discussion in the general narrative about well-being and the mental health, the rise of mental health problems. Do you have any insights with a specific SEND lens on all of that?
It's a big question. I think what Helen started out by saying about children seeming to kind of wilt a bit when they were not in the classroom environment is somewhat my experience, that the children have really they spark off each other and they do better in most cases, obviously not in all cases, as we've talked about. Having that opportunity to spark off each other and have learn from each other. I think my kind of general reflection is that for children or for anyone to work at home and learn at home, there is a set of kind of self-reflection and executive function skills that people have to draw on more. They have to be organized about their learning, and they have to be able to pick out when they don't know something and try and chase up finding out how to sort that out. And I think that's a useful skill to learn. And I think coming to the mental health aspects of things, I think the people who've suffered in terms of mental health have been the people who don't necessarily have those skills, who've fallen behind and don't know how to communicate that or how to help themselves get better. And I think it's, so Helen said in the chat, the metacognition around how to learn has been so important. And I think, it's useful for people to learn that, but if they don't have it, they often don't know what they don't have. And that makes it really difficult.
And sticking on the mental health and wellbeing side, what about your colleagues working in this field? How's it been playing out for them? Helen?
We've all been utterly exhausted. I mean, there's the whole, like, on Twitter, there's this whole, like, teacher tired thing, but teacher pandemic tired is it's like another world. Because, I mean, I know that from a personal point of view, I was in school 2 days a week, all day with the kids who needed that help. And you don't begrudge it, you get on with it, don't you? But then I was having to sort of spend, the other 9 days a week doing all the lesson setting and chasing after kids and phone calls. And I had it easy compared to some people. There were some schools that were running physical lessons for key worker kids, as well as then teachers recording the equivalent material for those that were learning at home. And, it's sort of through some research, I say that I'm in the middle of at the moment, the levels of exhaustion, and then to be sort of have the cloud of Ofsted coming and checking your provision. Unhelpful, I think, is the politest way that I can think of putting it. Unhelpful, because you kind of had the notion that parents can grass up your school, but teachers, when I did my PGCE, we didn't train for this. We went online. First lockdown in a weekend, second lockdown less than one working day. Now, we'd got things better in place, but we still had to update schemes of work. And I think there's a feeling of lack of recognition from the higher ups that we have done a lot. The changes between lockdowns were substantial, but the systemic problems around lack of access to tech, well, I haven't got 100 quid to buy each of my kids a laptop. We can't change that as teachers. That's a wholesale system change. And I think for me, that was the most frustrating thing, that some of our kids, if you haven't got a laptop or a device, you can't get online. So
where did all those laptops go that the government talk about?
Yes. Yeah. Again, my mother said, if I've nothing nice to say nothing. I'm going to stop talking.
But I guess I was going to come on to.
Sorry.
No, you've helped take me on to where I was going next, which is really around the support that was forthcoming through all of this, and how well schools, both inclusive mainstream schools and special schools, how much support they were able to give to staff, to parents, and how much support they themselves had. Do any of you have any insights on that? Yes, Pauline. Lorraine, sorry.
It's okay. I think Zoe's just put in the chat about the media portraying that all schools were closed was not helpful, because no school closed fully unless they, from a health and safety point of view, they had to. And as Helen said, each lockdown was different. So, the first one was probably less stressful. By the third one, when we were having to do remote learning, in-school learning, safeguarding, everything else, it was hard work. But I agree with Helen about the tech side of things. There's been a postcode lottery, but I think the biggest challenge for schools has been the government's response in terms of getting guidance out literally last minute. And as a chair of governors at a special school, the special school guidance always came as a second wave after the mainstream guidance. So there was always this feeling that special schools were, not as important, and a lot of the people that I work with at my special school, they, that's how they felt, that guidance was not coming out as fast. and the promises of the laptops, of funding, and an awful lot of that we now are realizing that it isn't isn't there, or you had to jump through so many hoops. And I think the other thing that people just haven't understood at whatever level is this country's connectivity to the internet is poor in some places. So you can have every device in the world, but if your connectivity is poor, you can't get onto the internet. You can't join a Zoom meeting. And again, I think that is an issue for the country as we go forward.
And yeah, Gareth, what's your insight? And in particular, I guess I'm interested in also what success looked like, and whether it's possible in this context to measure that, to have any kind of feel for success when you're dealing with all of the diverse range of needs that people had.
I suppose a couple of things that just come to mind from the discussions we've just had. I think there's an issue here with how people perceive school as the physical building, if that makes sense. And I think potentially the narrative over the last 10 years has pushed that into that view. So almost this has exposed that in a way, not looking at a lot of the work we would do, young people's experiences over the whole day, and looking how we maintain emotionally regulated opportunities for those learners throughout all the transitions from one thing to another. But I think some of the things that I certainly think I've been having conversations within educational settings, wherever they be, and bearing in mind quite a lot of the young people that I've been working with receive their education at home anyway, if that makes sense. So there's been a different dynamic and perhaps a lost group there within these narratives. But certainly for school settings, I think there's lots of positives to come from it. For example, holding parent and carer evenings online, I think literally staff and families have all found that immensely positive. And one of the conversations I have with every setting is what you're going to keep, And the other thing I think that a lot of primary schools and specialist provisions are doing is maintaining having lunch in their classrooms within bubbles, rather than people going into noisy canteens where there's a lot of emotional contagion and stress around the acoustics and things. And that allows them, in a lot of the schools that I've been working with, to engage in things like forest schools and outdoor learning as part of the curriculum, but also as part of flexible breaks for individuals to maintain that emotionally regulated flow through the day, rather than big intense periods and then breaks and stress. And at the end of the day, those stressful situations are stressful for everybody. We pass on our stress to others. So the more we can maintain those calm, purposeful environments, the better. So I do think there's some real positive things to come from it, but I think it all stems back to people knowing their young people and their families. And I think schools that didn't know that have found things with a much greater gulf, if that makes sense, than those that work well and co-produce things to start with,
And I'd love to hear others' positives of the things that they'd like to keep. But before I move away from you, Gareth, just you mentioned parents, and I suppose, I'm always interested in whether or not we've changed the relationship with parents, and obviously there'll be another big diversity around all of that, but have things shifted a little bit in terms of seeing parents more as allies, rather than people that you...
I suppose colleagues that know me or have worked with me in the past will know I'm sort of a bit obsessed with the notion of co-production. And actually, the issues are that professionals often assume the challenges that young people and families face and just bring them on board to meet the solutions. And we've got to relocate that power within that dynamic. And that, in essence, is what powerful and good co-production is about. And again, I think, though, almost this has just widened that gap. Schools that were pretty good at co-production found better solutions because, crudely speaking, they were jointly working and listening to the challenges and finding solutions as part of that outcomes-based approach. Schools and settings that were very hierarchical and set on rules and structure and imposing things on families became even worse with that regard, in my view. So I suppose I personally haven't changed my mind at all. We need to work collaboratively to get the best outcomes for the learners, really.
Is there any pattern that your passion and insight around co-production has gathered scale as a result of this sort of forced change that we've all been through?
Well, one thing I would say, and I know Lorraine put a little comment in the chat there about the idea that actually access to CPD and training has been much more accessible. And I certainly know a lot of the families that I've been working with have found that hugely beneficial, because for a family to go to a conference physically, you know, a parent or carer, that's almost impossible for a lot of the families we're working with, particularly with younger siblings, the travel distance, etc., etc. But to be able to access an online CPD session that you can watch at your leisure, be it in the middle of the day when young people are doing other things, or maybe when younger children have gone to bed at 8 o'clock at night or whatever, has been massive. And I think a lot of the free support that myself and others have been able to do within CPD have really changed that dynamic, I think. And so just to briefly sort of finish off on that, I've been really fortunate in the lockdown to do some work with schools and communities where we offer a whole school sort of training set up for everybody, like a twilight to set the base. Really intensive 2-day training for senior leaders and key staff, coupled with ongoing training and support for families, so that we can create this approach, if that makes sense, that goes across the whole young person's experience. And once you provide that, and you can do that sometimes within 1 week, and then provide ongoing coaching and support for all those involved, you've got a much better chance of sustaining outcomes. And I think the problem in schools often is that we've got line management systems which are about compliance, as opposed to coaching and supervision, which is about improving people.
Yeah. And I just generally have a view that the pandemic has highlighted there are some leaders who are compliance junkies, and then there are some leaders who are leaders. And Helen, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I think like Gareth, yay, not wrong. And I think, but what the thing that kind of bugs me a little bit is like when you read through the Code of Practice, when you read through the Children and Families Act that was supposed to be like this pioneering thing that was amazing and and it's going to make everyone equal partners. Well, like literally 10 years on, I got married 10 years ago. That thing all started kicking in 10 years ago. What's changed? Like it shouldn't take a pandemic to make various institutions, and it's at all levels. I'm like a massive Bourdieu in Scotland, so it's like this whole siloing of people within their own social position and having no or little effort from the societal structures to kind of allow the underlings, as it were, you know, only the parents to engage with these institutions. The whole purpose of 2011 and the subsequent changes in SEN law were supposed to empower parents. So what the chuff's been going on in the last 10 years? Because parents have been on their knees, and it shouldn't be down to individual schools to have like collaborative leadership. It shouldn't be down to a local LA who happens to have a couple of really good caseworkers who know how to speak plain English to parents, or provide materials in another language if need be. There's a fundamental problem in the structures that the pandemic has highlighted further. But goodness me, it shouldn't take people like us sitting here to say it. It was already said 10 years ago. There's nothing changed. And I think, Gareth, you bang on. I really love the work you've done. And I'm lucky that I get to do some similar stuff in Wiltshire, but it shouldn't be voluntary people or people like us doing it. It should be systematically, legally, structurally in place. Like,
Thank you.
Sorry. Sorry.
So I definitely want to hear from Lorraine and Julia on reflecting on that. And Lorraine, I know you did a lot of work on the Act 10 years ago, which doesn't mean you're then responsible for the implementation of it. But you'll have some reflections on what Helen's just said.
Absolutely. I mean, I remember being part of the Lamb inquiry which reported in 2009, which looked at parental what they thought about the system, which then led really to the reforms, a Green Paper in 2011 and then the Act in 2014. And I have to agree with Helen, you know, what has happened in the last 10 years. We seem to have got to a point where you know, parents are still having to, and I hate the word, but, you know, fight to get something for their youngsters. I think we've also seen an increase in the number of children in the system who have needs, and often, you know, very complex needs. And I think that, you know, that the DfE currently are doing an SEND review, which, you know, at the moment we have no idea what that's going to look like. They're meant to be reporting any day now. But it's got to be a root and branch review, and it, you know, we were talking earlier, and it has got to come with funding that sits behind it.
Yeah.
Not everything is about money. You know, there's lots of things we can do that are not about money. It's about system change, like Helen talked about. It's about strategic leadership and school leaders taking that responsibility. But unfortunately, the system that we've got at the moment is that schools are accountable in terms of results. And while you've got a system that is all about results, you will have some schools that will not support children with special needs because they will drag your results down. Now, that's not saying all schools, because there's lots of inclusive schools out there. I know the one where Gareth worked was incredibly inclusive, but there's lots of schools that the results are the be all and end all. And those are the schools where we're not getting the children and young people with special needs supported, either because they're just not getting the support, or actually they're not kept at the school long enough to do that.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you, Julia.
Yeah.
What do you see?
This is really interesting. I think what I would say from a research point of view is that the research tends to suggest that involving parents is hard and is quite often not very effective, which suggests to me that I mean, obviously we need to involve parents. I'm a parent myself, and I've supervised PhD students looking at the role of parents with SEND kids, and it's clear to me that they are marginalized, but I think it's really difficult. And I think what Lorraine says is absolutely right, that if you're focusing on results, and what Gareth said about compliance, if you're focusing on results and compliance, you're not focusing on relationships and what's best for individual children. And I think it's quite a major change maybe to get the parents involved, but maybe that's one of the things that we can learn from with the pandemic. That would be one of the things that I would hope, because parents have been an essential part of that learning relationship in a way that they weren't necessarily before, because so maybe we need to think about how we can learn from that and how things can change. And I think the online CPD, or the online resources for parents, is definitely one of those ways. I think schools have lagged behind lots of other areas in terms of how much they use online work, and that's something that they've had to increase and improve over the last year, and now they're in a good position, and there's lots of parents who would be keen to access that. Yeah.
Thank you. That helps me move to my next area of interest, which is around the role of technology. So we'll just sort of park the issue of access and the inequality of access, because we've touched on that, and we kind of all accept that there's still a lot to be done. And I'm now chairing something called the Digital Poverty Alliance, where we're working with various people with a bit of funding to really try and work out how we deal with that inequity around digital access for children. But let's move away from that to think about the role of technology and what we've learned around what technology can do, and can it redefine what's possible in some of the challenges that are ongoing. I'll start with you, Helen.
I think it can, yeah. One of the at my school, I do access arrangements. So, you know, if kids need extra time, or a reader or a scribe, or different coloured this, that and the other, you know, like overlays and whatnot. And kids in the real world, we use computers. Like, so for me, I think, and I've spoken to kids, and it's part of research that I'm doing, it's part of the review that I wrote this time last year. If kids had access to tech, however that happens, they can do their own access arrangements. They can make a font bigger. They can change the background of the screen. They can stick an overlay on the computer screen. They can have a computer, or they can choose to write. And I think it's the choice, because choice brings empowerment. Choice brings a freedom, a certain level of freedom. And I think for me, if technology is used well, is implemented well, and children and families are taught how to do that carefully and properly, then it could be utterly life-changing. In Wales, part of their curriculum, there's the digital literacy notion from Professor Tom Crick, and I think it's brilliant. In Uruguay, there's the Plan Ceibal, which is a laptop for every child, and it's these ideas where use of tech is embedded, it's expected, is life-changing. And if kids want to choose to write and use a piece of paper, they can. But choice, that's what it brings for me.
Good. Thank you. Interesting comment from Fran. Can't we use AI to learn how learners learn? And then it just docked out, thanks to David. And personalize it. And I'm sure we can. And that the personalization obviously is the promise of tech.
Yeah.
Have we seen that realized a bit more as a result of the pandemic, do you think?
I think so. Yes, I think so. Where children have had access to something, where they've been shown or have knowledge of how to use it, you know, the logistics of that will probably a whole other argument and a lifetime study, but where kids can use it, access it, and where teaching engages with that, you know, where teachers record stuff or use stuff that's tech friendly, then it's life-changing, because you can play it, you can stop it, you can pause it, you can rewind it, you can make it bigger, you can take a photo of it. It's just utterly life-changing. You know, for dyslexic students, being able to record themselves talking about whatever topic they're doing versus having to write by hand is transformational. Or for an autistic child who needs to just for a moment put a stop on it, have a moment, recenter themselves, it's brilliant. And I think that is transformational. It's not necessarily not quantifiable potentially, and that's where we'll wriggle and squirm.
And then, you know, maybe one of the others wants to comment on this, but clearly there's then the workforce challenge around that. And, you know, have you observed any pattern around workforce confidence and adoption of having to use technology more for delivery, and the appetite to retain? So I've got you're competing. This is good. I'll start with Lorraine and then come to Gareth.
Well, in the teachers I've talked to, I think they went on an incredibly steep learning curve very quickly. I think they had to, because of the situation we found ourselves in, we all had to step up to the plate and really, you know, get to grips with technology. And you know, the majority of teachers and teaching assistants have done an absolutely fantastic job, and have, you know, really relished the use of technology. And obviously, you know, the development of the Oak National Academy with BBC Bite Size, with teachers sharing lessons because they've recorded them, assemblies being recorded so the whole school watches but in their bubbles. I mean, I think that, you know, we've moved mountains. What I would hate to see is we lose all of that. And my worry is that as soon as we're all back to normal and we're all back in the classroom and the teacher has to stand at the front, we won't use that technology in the same way. And I think that You know, some youngsters have embraced technology, some maybe not so much, and the same for teachers. I think there's still a big CPD issue around using technology and, you know, teachers using technology. And I think we should be doing that from as early an age as possible. I agree with Helen in terms of, for some youngsters, it breaks down the barriers. I mean, one of the things that I feel, you know, I always get on a soapbox about is handwriting. And, you know, if you take a child in reception or in year one, you know, when they go into the workplace, they will not have paper and pens. Everything that they do will be on technology. So why are we making them write in cursive handwriting when physically or emotionally it's a real barrier? So,
one day the schools minister will not be Nick Gibb.
No, okay. But also, I do think, Jim, just as a side, that, and I'm one of these, that teachers are also obsessed by stationery and paper and pens. So, you know, I think it's part of the culture. But anyway, Gareth.
Well, I think that comes in quite nicely there, Lorraine, because I think for me, what I would suggest is that schools that we used to empowering independence and personalization, and, you know, to quote a colleague and friend of mine, Damien Milton, you know, to talk about personalization, not normalization, those that really have that embedded in their school cultures actually were in a much better place. So, for example, a large number of the young people at the school I was Senko for 17 years had a reader pen in their pocket, and that was their normal way of accessing text that wasn't working. So they just had it in their pocket, drew it over the words, and it spoke out what was happening to them, or looked on the dictionary for definitions. A large number of young people we taught typing skills to, and they had a £22 Bluetooth keyboard that linked to the iPad, and they just typed everything in class. Now, that's their normal way of working. So actually, simply transferring that into the home environment, and a lot of the support we were doing with families was looking how we created dedicated learning spaces, etc. And I think many adults working from home have these same challenges, of course. Not everybody has a sauna to work in, you see, Jim. But anyway, the point is that actually, if you had those ways of working, which is what I call really understanding what outcomes we want to achieve for learners, and we want independence. So actually, when young people are adults, they can do things independently. And another thing, a bit of tech that we've used a lot, and again, I don't have any shares in these things, is an app called My Picture Path that was developed by a parent that I know very well of an autistic learner. And that allows you to schedule the day in a digital format that progresses throughout the day. It allows school and home to communicate, but also supports, and I use this term, sort of transcends home and school in effect, in the fact that you can put on it how you're getting up, brushing your teeth, the routines for home, then it progresses into maths, etc. And then I think the best schools were the ones that actually understood that learning wasn't all online. If you've ever had a 5 hours online in a day, it's like 20 hours, isn't it, talking to somebody? It's exhausting. And actually schools that said, right, between 10 and 12, you go out into the park or the garden, you go and find 10 creepy crawlies, take a picture of them or something like that, or you do practical things, or the sport was brought in. We created a better flow for learning for young people rather than just looking at it in a one-dimensional way, in my view.
Yeah. And well, lots of thoughts are stimulated. I mean, you know, I'm obviously very privileged, and I'm a bit of a tech guy, and I will use an Apple Pencil to input. I'll use a keyboard to input. I'll use dictation to input. You know, there's, you know, voice, I think, as a way of inputting into tech will grow and grow. So we've got lots of different choice, as you say, and I would love assessments to reflect some of that choice, so that we're not trapping people with paper and pen. I will bring you in again, Lorraine, imminently. I suppose the other thing that I would just reflect is, I'm on a select committee at the moment looking at how we get the nation more physically active, and we've had some debate about esports, which are obviously very popular, but they're kind of sedentary. And you know, is there a path from esports? You know, you're looking perplexed. Things like FIFA, from esports to sport. And the response I got from one of the experts we were interviewing was, we should learn from their learning design. We should learn from gamification, and just how compelling the experience is that sort of traps people being sat down for all that time, and how can we design things that are not sedentary to be as compelling as that? And I think there is a read across into the potential for technology where we can learn from some of the other technologies around design. Lorraine.
Yeah, it was just interesting when you just said about using speech and technology. And yet in schools, we have reduced the amount of oracy and speaking and listening that actually we deliver now in early years.
Yeah.
And you know, the new early years foundation stage framework that coming in from September appears, I mean, I know colleagues won't do this, but, you know, appears to have less sort of speaking and listening. So it's interesting, isn't it, that we're sort of saying reading and writing are really important. Yes, they are, and reading definitely, but actually that speaking and listening is also going to be really, really important if we're going to use speech to text type software or dictation software in the future. So I just thought about that as you were saying it.
But I find dictation a really difficult skill because organizing your thoughts sufficiently to then dictate is a big skill, but I think it's really valuable.
Yeah.
But I won't allow us to be too distracted by that. But it's interesting. The other thing I just wanted to touch on with technology is whether it allows us to do things that perhaps we might have thought of as previously inconceivable. And I had a meeting this week with ALFI, the Alliance for Inclusive Education, which is run by disabled people who are passionate about essentially special schools being segregation and their desire for all SEND to be inclusive within a mainstream setting. And my question, inspired by them, is to ask whether a more strategic, thought through deployment of technology can advance our ability to integrate more learners into mainstream. The chat's got massively distracted by fitness, so I'm just ignoring it now. Helen.
I have real like ethical dilemmas about this because, and I think, and Gareth probably knows more than I do, but I just see some of our.
Oh, you're frozen.
I don't know whether I know anything about it now.
Gareth, why don't you pretend you know something about it while we get Helen back?
Certainly, and maybe on the wider view, but you know, I know ALFI very well. I was very fortunate to do quite a bit of work with them when Tara Flood was the CEO and things like that. And I think, you know, we haven't learned, I don't think necessarily, from some of the stuff Mel Ainscough was doing with the Index for Inclusion and looking at how, you know, in Australia in the 90s, they co-located specialist and mainstream schools and actually had those joint approaches, and that allowed that learning, if you like, across the sectors to happen. So I think there's been a significant issue with sort of dividing expertise in a way, and that's been further exposed as we've decided, you know, in the previous discussions with regard to the last 12 months, I would argue.
Yeah, good. Helen, I'm glad you're back. You know, the dog ate your cable, I gather, was the excuse.
I don't have a clue. It just went weird. Yeah, like we have so many. I really struggle with where people find the world overwhelming, and we are making them sit in a classroom where actually it is sensory torture for them. Yeah. Is that inclusion? I don't have an answer. I literally bore my husband for hours about this, and sometimes you think actually a smaller thing, better provision would be better. Now, whether that is attached to a mainstream school, that's a better way forward. I don't know, but I just don't know what to do with that. I'll shut up in case my computer has a moment again.
My reflection, I guess, was that there's obviously always going to be a need for specialist provision. The question is whether the specialist provision is segregated off into a different institution or whether it is more integrated into a mainstream institution. And that in my head was the core thing. Gareth.
And just to follow up on that, and I know I don't want to go too off tangent with this, so I've tried to be very disciplined. It just brings me right back to when I was very fortunate to do quite a bit of work in Chile, and we went in 2016 with a group of colleagues when they brought in an inclusion law for the first time. We were talking to 60 head teachers, all white blokes in the 50s or 60s, saying to them, this is fantastic. These young people who have disabilities and additional learning needs are going to be coming to your schools. Well, let's just say it was a bit of a tough audience. I'll leave it there. But the reality was, part of the issue there was how they defined success. And I think if you define success purely as a narrow academic output, you therefore limit opportunities for people to look at the wider community. If we define success about looking at serving a community rather than fragmenting the education system with lots of different types of schools and different motivations, etc., you allow that inclusive vision of co-locating and supporting people within communities. And just to finish off with that, a lot of our work as an organisation now is very much about supporting people away from secure settings to live in their communities. And it's often much cheaper to buy a house and provide 3-on-1 24-hour staffing than it is where people are locked up all day. So it makes sense for me that community should drive it, not a narrow definition of success.
Thank you. I want to bring in Julia on this inclusion question, but Lorraine, you've also got your hand up. So I'll start with Julia, then Lorraine, and we've only got 9 minutes left, and I've got one other quick round robin question for each of you. Julia, go.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure.
Okay, Lorraine, let me go to you, and then I can come back to Julia if you've got anything you want to say.
I'm just reacting really to Fran's comment about DfE would love all children being mainstream as it would cost less. I actually think that if every single mainstream school had to have an environment and accommodation to meet the needs of every learner, it would cost significantly more. If the special school where I'm chair of governance, every room has got hoists. Between every room, we've got personal care facilities. Now, if you had to have that in every single mainstream school, it would cost so much money. And so I agree with you, Jim. I think that, and I've had this debate for many, many years. I think there is always going to be a requirement for specialist provision. But again, like my colleagues, I think that should be closely linked, attached, whatever you want to call it, to the mainstream sector. So we don't have mainstream and special. We have a school, but there is a specialist provision for those youngsters that need some of that specialist support.
Bro, thank you. Okay, my last question, I'll go around each of you, it's the sort of thinking then about the future, reflecting on our conversation and the experience of the last 12 months or so. What do we really want to make sure we use in terms of a momentum created by lockdown, or some lessons that we've learned to really embed into the future, just so that we can finish with hope and optimism? I will start, Helen, with you, because you've just got optimism written all over your face. So we'll go with you, and then I'll come to you, Julia, Gareth, and then Lorraine.
My bee in my bonnet is get kids in schools, get them a laptop. It will be your Tesco's value equivalent laptop. It's not going to be your Waitrose one. Get them a laptop, get them using it, get them a dongle so they can get online and give them those life skills. And it isn't rocket science. It's doable.
Brill, lovely, thank you. Julia?
Yeah, I think along the same lines, what we really should take is how flexible schools and children can be if it's needed, and how much things can change direction. I feel like we've spent years and years with teachers saying they haven't got time to learn about tech, which I'm sure they haven't. Or that the school's not providing reliable tech. But when they really need to use it, they can, and they can really support, really changed the way that learning's delivered.
Yeah.
So I'm really hopeful that that continues.
Thank you. Good. Gareth.
Yeah, well, for me, and I think it's probably not a surprise that people are going to hear this now, but, you know, we've got to understand, I think, that schools and professionals that worked really well with families have the best outcomes for learners, you know, in my view. So just to give you one further example, because I like to be quite practical in this, you know, schools, for example, that wrote a letter home to families, but also recorded it on Zoom and provided the podcast so you could email that and parents could just listen to it while they're waiting in the supermarket or whatever, allowed much greater access to information than those sort of, you know, 0.8 sort of letters on an A4 sheet with that many logos. You can hardly see what you're looking at, you know. So the point is, I think, understanding that need for access and true collaboration and co-production should definitely be something at the top of the agenda for me.
Brilliant. Rose has arrived with her hand up. So before I come to you, Lorraine,
Okay.
Rose will be unmuted.
After Lorraine, go to
After
Lorraine first.
I was just going to say, the one thing that I hope that we move forward on is that we understand that a child's attendance does not always have to be that their backside is on a chair in front of a teacher in a classroom in a school. That actually they can be attending if they're at the coffee shop, if they're at home, but they've got a device, they're linked into whatever is happening in the classroom, or they're doing independent work. But for some youngsters, especially those that who've got school refusal, or their mental health is such that, you know, they find going into school really difficult, we can really engage those learners in a different way. And we know it works because it's worked during lockdown.
Yeah, I mean, you can even engage standing up. You know, it's remarkable. Rose.
I just wanted to come in and say, actually, I didn't know that's what you were going to say, Lorraine, but it's been something that the team here have been, we talk about such a lot, is the need to move away from attendance being seen as a success factor. Just the being there somehow is the thing that matters, when it just so doesn't. So it was really interesting hearing you say that, Lorraine. But what I just wanted to say is, this has been, I think, and Jim, I want to ask you this question, I think this has been the most positive webinar we've done in this series, which I think is really interesting, given that all the reports would suggest that the community that we're discussing has been the one that's had the most problems. But I'm also struck by the amazingly sensible, practical, as Helen said, it's not rocket science. You know, there are so many things that wouldn't cost a fortune that could be done, and yet we bash our heads against a brick wall trying to get them done. So I just feel, thank you. It's so positive and so many sensible suggestions. And how the heck do we manage to get more notice taken of these very practical, sensible, economical suggestions when Nick's gone, perhaps? But you know, it seems crazy that some of these things can't just be done.
Absolutely, and in part that positivity and optimism is thanks to the individuals that have been in the conversation, and I am hugely grateful to you for that. I would say in the 15 years or so that I've been obsessing about education, it is so often the case that when I deal with people who specialize in SEND, they have just real clarity, insight, and optimism and love in their, you know, which, you know, there's not enough love in most schools, and the warmth that we've enjoyed in the last hour has just been inspiring. So I'm massively grateful. Thank you very much, everyone. We're now out of time. Roland is saying a big thank you, so that means I must be out of time. Thank you all. We'll have another one of these in a month about something else, and Roland's probably about to tell you what it is. But I've really loved it today. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Yeah,
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. So as Jim says, we've got another one on 24th of June. in the morning, and it's just going to be on data, as I mentioned at the beginning. I put the link in the chat, but you can find it on our Twitter. If you've subscribed to our YouTube in the session, then we'll put it up there as well. So thank you to our guests. Thank you to the audience for coming along, and I won't keep you guys any longer because it's lunchtime now.
Cool.
All right, take
Thank
it
you all.
easy.
See you.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye everyone. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.